For the last 12 years, I've always been here at the symposium, and every year I have the distinct pleasure of introducing a gentleman I love and admire, as we all do. Now, Joe Stukes, in addition to the information you have there, Professor Emeritus of Francis Marion University, and he also is a Chautauqua performer, and over the years has developed more than 120 character presentations, and has always been gracious enough to bring us one every year. And we have been enlightened and educated and entertained. We have met Francis Marion, Light Horse Harry Lee, Otto Williams, John Rutledge, Henry Lawrence, Major James, and a myriad of other people who were giants of the Revolution. And tonight is no different. Tonight we will meet General William Moultrie, now retired, a two-time governor of South Carolina, and we meet him as he reminisces about his experiences in the Revolutionary War. Will you join me in welcoming General William Moultrie?
Well, hello. Hello. You've come at a bad time. You've interrupted me. So be patient with me. I have just gotten a letter that has distressed me. And it's difficult for me to get used to it and absorb it. You know, when you get as old as I am, I'm 75 this year, 75. And at this time, you know, oh, it's so hard to get around this time. It used to be. Here's what's upset me. It's telling me that Francis Marion has died. Well, he wasn't 70. But he'd been such a good man. And he did not brag about himself. He's sort of the epitome of what a good man ought to be. And in all my 75 years, I haven't met anybody that I like more than Francis Marion. Well, you know, Francis Marion came from the Marion family. He's one of those who lived up in St. John's Parish. Outstanding family, he and his brothers. He lived for a while down near Georgetown, but the family had moved back. And he was not as old as I. You know, I was a son of a physician, and my ancestors came originally from France and through Scotland and all the way to South Carolina. I had 4 children of my own, and they're all gone. And now Francis Marion's gone too. You know, I first married what they said that is the way to make money. I married it. I married Demarius St. Julian and she's from St. Julian family. We lived together about 12 years. We had 2 children and they died. First, the girl died early. Well, the second one that I married, her name was Hannah Lynch. Her father-in-law had signed the Declaration of Independence. And she was now a widow. And so she was my second wife. All of us were Protestant, we were Huguenots with a French background. But the state religion in South Carolina, after a while when there was no state religion, and one of the reasons why so many people got attracted to South Carolina is because there was freedom of religion, but now it's Anglicanism. And it wasn't the beliefs that separated us so. As a matter of fact, like a lot of people, going to church was going to church. Nobody to pay much attention to the priest or the preacher. We just went to church. And so, since Anglicanism was a state religion, I went to the Anglican church. Belonged to St. Philip's. Paid the pew rent so that our family could worship at St. Philip's. But we were often in Charleston. As a matter of fact, we tried to be, with both my wives, part of the society of Charleston. We attended the dances and the plays. We enjoyed some of the gossips that we ran into in Charleston. You know, we were successful as social people. I was modestly successful as a farmer, an agriculturalist. I found that for this agriculturalist. I found that out because I had married into the better areas and acreage, raised some indigo, made a little money, not much. Part of the society that we enjoyed was not just the dances and the plays. We all had our horses. I had a horse called Old Starly. People told me he was the best looking horse in all of South Carolina. Maybe they were just saying that. But he was a good horse, a fast moving horse. Let me make you wait for a moment while I try to write a little bit. I'm trying to write a letter to Frances Marion's widow, just to let her know that I have not forgotten him. People have a habit of forgetting. But I'll take up my own story about myself for you. A man in my position thinks that he has to do what he can do to help the government, to perform some public service. And like a lot of people, particularly my neighbors and friends, I offered for the state commons, that is the council, and I was elected. I was not a very good speaker, but I was accepted. I was what in England they call a backbencher, that I sat on the back bench and didn't say much, but I voted all the time and I was always present. That's one way that I had met and exchanged some opinions with Francis Marion. But the main way was the military with Francis Marion. All of us who own property, you know, we went to muster days, usually once a month, but sometimes more frequent than that. All of us, we brought our own weapons. We were supposed to learn drill. We had no army, and so we had the militia instead. I liked the military. I was drawn to it. My men that I dealt with, they knew that I was close to the military. I proved it in the war that we had against the Cherokees. It was in 1757 and 58 and even 1759. We joined with Lieutenant Colonel Grant, and had been sent down to lend a hand with us against the Cherokees. The Indians were always giving us problems. I suppose they thought we were giving them problems too. But there were problems. Let's see, you spell it R-A-N-C-I-S. But back to the Cherokees. Our militia unit marched against the Cherokees in the northern part of South Carolina, really the northwestern part, up near 96 in that district. And the Indians were waiting for us, and the Indians ambushed us. We had several wings of our militia. All of them, with one exception, when the Indians attacked with their war whoops and with their weapons that they had gotten from the British, and they came after us, only the units led by Francis Marion held their ground. They had terrific losses, very high number, a percentage of the losses. So much so that Francis Marion rarely spoke of it later, but he held the line. The fighting lasted almost the whole day. Indians finally broke. The Indians broke. And we chased the Indians further into Indian territory. We were vicious in destroying Indian villages and chasing down what Indians we could, until finally their famous chief out of color, came and asked for peace. When I came home, I had to write up about the battle, because I had been the commander. I wrote this about Francis Marion. And I want to write this to his widow, because I think she'll enjoy it. He, Marion, was an active, brave, and hardy soldier. Excellent partisan officer. I called his name, sent him his report. Report later found his way through the governments in the northern states. Francis Marion's name was on the records. Not much publicity for him, but his name was on the records. But it was time, and we learned from the Indian troubles, that we needed to organize in South Carolina. And so, back in South Carolina and near Charleston, we organized a military unit. At first there were 2 regiments. The legislature, we call it the Commons House. The Commons House voted to establish us as a military unit. We decided to have the 2 regiments, and they voted to see who would be the commander of the regiments. The first commander was a man with whom I had been friends. As a matter of fact, we were neighbors and personal friends. His name was Charles Coatsworth Pinckney. He came from the Pinckney family, famous family, successful family, remarkable people. Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, educated, talented, a hard-working, sincere, and serious person. Good man to be a leader. Not much military background, but a good man to be a leader. Leader of the 2nd Regiment, and is the one who came in second in the voting, was myself, William Moultrie. And so I was made a colonel of the 2nd Regiment. Beneath the colonel, we elected other officials. We elected majors and captains. One of the captains' name for my 2nd Regiment was Francis Marion. We had militia that we were trying to make in the military. We had stored some ammunition and all sorts of military equipment that we had in Fort Dorchester, a few miles north of Charleston. It's an area with which I was familiar, and Francis Marion was familiar. And so I gave orders that Francis Marion, our Captain Marion, later Major Marion, for him to go and to protect our holdings in what we were calling Fort Dorchester. Now, you know, I had lived in one of the parishes, I had lived in one of the parishes that was north of Charleston. This parish where this fort was, we called Dorchester. And I spent my time trying to build up a fort, trying to establish successful defense positions, and also disciplining the militia. Militia's hard to discipline. These are people who don't know how to take orders from the military, and they do pretty much what they wanted to do. Sometimes what they wanted to do would endanger their fellows. For instance, one of the orders I gave was that every man would cut his hair so that it was no longer than his neck was, so the hair could come down to the shoulders. And as far as hair is concerned, they had to wash their hair at least once every 2 weeks because you know, the hair would get so oily and greasy, and they would have lice in it. And so I gave the orders, that kind. Not necessarily a military, but it was trying to make a military unit together. And we had disobedience, we had desertions. We recaptured some of the deserters. I had several of them whipped publicly. But sometimes I gave more humorous punishments. For instance, in some cases I would say to the offender after we brought him back into the camp that he must wear a petticoat for a week so that his neighbors and friends and co-workers in the military would realize that he was the one who had not obeyed, and he was the undisciplined militia. But you know what? And it was Francis Marion. He was bored. There was not much action to take. There was protection, but no enemy to fight. There was no fighting that was done. He came to me one day, because I was his colonel, and asked to be reassigned. Well, I didn't know exactly what to do with, in those days, Captain Marion. But I finally decided to give him orders to go down to the fort that we were building, down on Sullivan's Island, which is in the harbor of Charleston. If indeed any naval vessels attempted to capture Charleston, they would be passing by Sullivan's Island. And of course, the great naval power that might endanger us were the British. And so we had Captain Marion down. We brought a few guns in, put him in charge of the artillery. And then in 1776, it was in the latter part of June, the British sent 5 of their ships, a fine naval weapon, to take Charleston, to sail in and take Charleston from the sea, not from the land, from the sea. They had to pass through narrow areas with shoals. And on the 28th of June, a fight erupted between us on Sullivan's Island. Our fort wasn't complete. And we built with what we could build with. We took palmetto logs. And the reason we took palmetto logs is that's the trees over there on the island. So we had to take what we could use. Palmetto. By the way, I think she'd be interested to know about her husband, but palmetto. And we built a fortress, a wall of palmetto trees, and then a portion of land, and then another wall. When the British decided to attack, they opened fire on us. I was in command. We fired back. We didn't have much in the way of weapons. We didn't have enough to fight a good, solid battle. What we had to do somehow or another was to conserve our ammunition and to be accurate, that we would fire from the fort to the British ships. We did that. Francis Marion commanded the artillery. He did a good job for us. Meanwhile, the British were firing back at us, and they fired great numbers of volleys against us. Fighting lasted almost all day at this end, about 10 hours. During that time, there were 12 of my men who were killed. Another 5 died a few days later. There were 25 wounded. The figures weren't bad, but the fact that the men had been killed, that was bad. On the other hand, our artillery, taking very careful aim, fired as best they could, and they were amazingly accurate. So much so that one of the British ships, the most famous of the British ships, the biggest of the British ships, trying to maneuver and escape and get into Charleston, was beached by a sandbar. That left 4 ships for the British. On one of those ships was the man who had been the royal governor of South Carolina. His name was Campbell. He had been a British naval officer himself before he became the governor. He married into an American family, the Izzard family. And so he regarded himself as partly South Carolina. He took the fact that we were fighting against the British personally. He had to flee Charleston, got aboard the ship, the Bristol. One of our guns found the Vista. The demand, the artillery was superb. The man who had been the governor of South Carolina, Governor Campbell, himself was wounded. He wasn't killed aboard the ship, but as I learned later, he was carried back to England when the British decided to leave Charleston. And there he died from the effects of the wound. Another man who was wounded was Peter Parker. He's the #1 naval man in the British Navy in this area. He too was personally wounded. And so was his lieutenant, whose name was Edward Cornwallis. Cornwallis was an earl, so it goes down as Lord Cornwallis. It was a terrific battle. One dramatic thing happened in the battle, and that is one of the British balls hit the flag that we had put up. We didn't have a flag. This was June the 28th in 1776. It was before the Declaration of Independence was written. So we didn't have we were still a royal colony. And there were great numbers of people in South Carolina who hoped that we would remain, that our problems with Britain would somehow or another, through negotiation and through peaceful talks, would redeem itself and become a colony again. We had that dream. But after that battle, it was not so. But to get back to the flag, the flag staff was hit. The flag itself was felled. We didn't have much of a banner. We had a blue field, and on that we had, in the center of it, we had a crescent. The rising of a new country, a new birth. When that flag was hit and the flag staff was broken, one man came to me, one of my sergeants. He really was under command of Francis Marion. And he asked if he could somehow or another see to it that we mounted the flag again. And I asked him how in the world he's going to do that. That would have put the flag on the first parapet, and with the British firing at it. And without a word, he turned and he ran, climbed aboard, exposing himself to danger, grabbed the fallen flag, brought it back on the nether side of the wall, and helped nail it to another pole and raise the flag again. It was a dramatic gesture. It didn't kill any of the enemy, but it inspired some of the men. Later that became a well-told story. And when the president of South Carolina, he was a president, he's John Rutledge, we're still a colony, we're not yet a state, so we don't have a governor, we've got a president. And John Rutledge came to congratulate us and to rejoice in the victory, and brought his own personal sword and awarded it to Sergeant Jasper. Sergeant Jasper later, in his own way, followed through with bravery, and down around Savannah in an attack later, he was hit and killed. You know, what are we going to do about a flag? Since we don't have a flag. Well, they came to me and asked me to devise a flag since I was a commanding officer. I've got it written down as to what it did. I will send some of this to Francis Barnes with it too. Yeah, here it is. I guess that's where I know exactly where it is. It's right here on this table. Somewhere on this table, but I think this could be it. Oh, yeah. This is from memoirs, which I am working on too, if I can ever finish this letter. A little time after we were in possession of Fort Johnson, that's a separate fort in Charleston, it was thought necessary to have a flag for the purpose of signals, as there was no national or state flag at the time. I was desired by the Council of Safety to have one made, upon which, as the state troops were clothed in blue, and the fort was garrisoned by the 1st and 2nd regiments, who wore a silver crescent in front of their caps. And I had a large blue flag made with a crescent in the dexter corner to be in uniform with the troops. This was the first American flag which was displayed in South Carolina. And on being first hoisted, it gave some uneasiness to our timid friends who were looking forward still to a reconciliation with Great Britain. They objected to a flag that was different from the British flag. They said this had the appearance of a declaration of war. But we did have the flag, and we used it when we could, not regularly, but it was a flag. We flew that flag down as we approached Savannah later and attacks on Savannah. We tried several times to overrun Savannah, failed every time. Sometimes it was our fault for some very foolish military activities and orders. Once we got defeated because the French, who were about to help us with their navy, decided in the midst of the battle days to leave the navy, take their navy away. And they took away their own troops and their own ships. Finally, in 1780, after we had had several years of peace, from 1776 in June, with the exception of the attacks on Savannah, 1780 was 3.5 years later, the British, they came back. A pair of brothers named Prevost led British troops, this time not through the water, not trying to capture Charleston by sea, but over land. And there was some help that South Carolinians got from, in those days, commanders who were commanded by George Washington. For now it was 1780. We had declared ourselves independent states. And these independent states were there fighting as best they could. And we tried to hold the British back. Washington sent us some men, not enough. Sent us some powder, not enough. Sent us some guns, not enough. Nevertheless, we had more than 5,000 effective fighters. We were a sizable force. And then with some maneuvering and some counter-maneuvering, we suddenly found ourselves in a position where we were practically surrounded with the water behind us and the British in front of us. And the commander that George Washington had sent us was a man named Benjamin Lincoln. He was a huge man, well over 6 feet tall, and well over 200 pounds, and a good soldier. And he suggested that what we better do was to move that army away from Charleston before it was completely surrounded, and the British would take over in Charleston. It seemed to be reasonable until the word got out among the leaders of the Charleston community, those property owners in Charleston, those people who had ships and were still trying to trade, although they were now smugglers. The arguments went back and forth as to whether we ought to stop and fight the British or whether we ought to retreat. Long decision. Big argument. Finally, Benjamin Lincoln, even though I was one of those who voted against this, decided the thing to do was to surrender. And so, in 1780, Charleston was surrendered to the British. We all became prisoners. Everybody who was in Charleston at the time had to surrender. And that's why my friend, Francis Marion, was still able to fight on. He was not captured. He was not in town. He had sustained an image, a serious blow, by the way, and a broken ankle. He was unable to walk. And he had been taken away from Charleston back to his home where he was recuperating. And so when the surrender's terms came, he was not included. But I was, because I was in Charleston at the time. So was my next door neighbor and best friend, Charles Coatsworth Pinckney. We had to surrender, regardless of the fact that our rank was high. As a matter of fact, I spent the rest of the Revolutionary War until the very end as a prisoner. Now, many of our people got put on prison ships. The British had no prison camp to keep the prisoners. As a matter of fact, the Americans didn't have any prison camps to keep the British prisoners. And so, prisoners from both sides suffered terribly. What did happen as far as the British were concerned, they converted some of their ships, their vessels, into prison vessels. And they shipped a good many of them down in St. Augustine in Florida and off the coast down there where these people were held in captivity as prisoners for the rest of the war. For people like me with a high rank and Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, we were not put aboard the ships, but we were imprisoned within bounds near Charleston. Now, Charles Coatsworth and I, we spent the last part of the war at Snee Farms. There was a home there that was occupied by one of Charles Coatsworth's cousins with whom he had grown up in his own family. And we just remained as his guests during the war. We were restricted to that area, put on parole. We were unable to move beyond. Occasionally, with special permission, we were allowed to move out from strict boundaries, but we did not have any freedom of movement. I wrote on several occasions asking that I be exchanged. Exchange seemed to be impossible. Usually a prisoner exchange in those days, as you will remember, those exchanges were officer for officer, that is rank for rank. And one of the problems was that the Americans had ranks, but not at the same levels and smooth gradations that the British had. And so we were unable to find a good solution. Lord Montague, one of the British leaders, came to see me one day at Snee Farms and suggested that if I would agree to reconvert to be a British citizen and to be happy with a British citizen, to agree that he would renounce any allegiance to this new state of South Carolina and to renew his allegiance to the British. I turned him down immediately. I would not have it. I even made a counter suggestion, and I thought that I might personally be exchanged for Lord Rawdon, who had been one of the British leaders. But Lord Rawdon outranked me, and no permit was ever issued. Finally, it was in the latter stages of the war. It was all but over. There was a mass exchange between Americans, who are now no longer British citizens, but Americans, against the British. 450 men were exchanged. Well, it was just before the war was over. Francis Marion had revived after his broken ankle. He and I had very little to do with each other after that. I became a Continental officer, and I zeroed in on Charleston, and then, of course, I spent those years in captivity. Meanwhile, he continued to fight, and he began to make name for himself, but mainly for his men, as he kept the flame of liberty alive in the seacoast areas of South Carolina. Well, when the war was over, Francis Marion and I met each other again. In the first of the constitutions, he was a senator and I was a representative of a constitution. We met in political hall, in legislative hall, for various reasons. And we met with success among themselves. It was good to make reunions. But Miss Marion didn't make friends easily. We were not very, very close. We were all the same side. We knew how to trust one another. We respected one another. But there was no great love between us. I was elected the governor of South Carolina in the year of 1783. That's when we had established ourselves as a state. The British king had finally agreed to call us rebels. And if we were rebels, we decided that we would be rebels and that we would have our own government. And we created the state of South Carolina. And I was elected the governor. I was elected again 3 years later. So I was governor of South Carolina two times. And you know what? The problems remain the same. I found that one of the jobs of the government, led by the governor, was to reestablish the finances. You know, we had to decide what was the legal tender. You know, just how much was a pound worth? How much was a piece of 8 worth? How much was a guilder worth? How much was a thaler worth? And when we established those, the prices went out, and we found that inflation had come. And it turned the government also almost upside down. Great numbers of people who had lost areas, that is, lost land, lost their cattle, lost their slaves, lost their houses, now wanting to rebuild. Many of them wanted to rebuild exactly like they had it beforehand. They wanted to be as upper class and upper level as they had been before. They wanted to resume the life of a British noble. And great numbers of people went into huge amounts of debt. The debt coming largely from British bankers. And so we found ourselves, although we didn't admit it to begin with, that we were once more being colonized by the British, this time not in a physical sense, not in a geographical sense, but in a financial sense. We needed to somehow regulate the finances. Another thing that we needed to regulate was the militia. You know, sometimes the militia had behaved itself. Sometimes it had not. The desertion rate during the revolutionary days was terrifically high. And only officers like Francis Marion, with their personalities, with the fact that they were respected by others, were able to mount serious offenses in the name of South Carolina. There was another problem too about finances, and that is, just who owes what for the revolution. Generally speaking, during the revolution, as long as military things or things useful for the army, like a horse, for instance, it could be taken from the owner without any pay. But other things, for instance, his pigs, his crops, his corn, and maybe articles of furniture and such from his house, that should be paid. We began to take offers from people who say they had lost so much money. And some of those were very, very highly inflated in number. Anyway, South Carolina couldn't quite settle things. We offered to give away land in the upper part of the state instead of paying money, but people didn't want to move. And so giving them land was not satisfactory. The government of South Carolina set up a 3-man committee between the terms when I was governor. I was the head of the committee. My friend Gervais, he was on the committee, Vanderhorst, the three of us. We worked for a little over a year and finally reported back to the legislature that it was just an insoluble problem. We could not get it straight. The other insoluble problem had to do with foreign trade. We had lost our markets. And now we no longer belong to the British. So the British markets were not open to us. If we wanted to trade in the Caribbean, as we had beforehand, we couldn't trade with the British. We could trade with the Dutch, pay Dutch prices, and we lost the subsidies that the British had given us. We learned how to smuggle. South Carolinians, they make good smugglers. And a good many of our problems were solved that way, which only brought in more because it increased the lawlessness. Sometimes the lawlessness was violent. Sometimes the lawlessness had to do with money. Sometimes the lawlessness was what we had begun to call white-collar crimes. Being the governor was no bed of roses. And Charleston was part of the problem. Those people in Charleston, they think they are the whole state. They have very little confidence, very little temper for the rest of the state. And so, after great debates and all sorts of problems, political problems, we decided to have a new state capital. We turned the issue over to the commission, and they decided after long, and by the vote of one, decided to build a new capital. We built it on the banks of the Congaree River. That enabled us to use the river for transportation within the state. We call it Columbia. And some people who didn't like it said we took a damn fool step and built on a damn fool riverbank a damn fool city. We named the main street Assembly, General Assembly. It's too long to be called General Assembly, so we just called it Assembly. And the cross street, of course, was called Senate. Other streets named for revolutionary heroes. The main street was Richardson Street, but Richardson is too long too, and so gradually it came to be known as Main. So we have now a city. Had to compromise with Charleston, and the finance offices for the state of South Carolina were two, one in Charleston, one in Columbia. Charlestonians could pay their taxes and go to court in Charleston. People in other parts of the state would have to travel either to Columbia or to Charleston. But one of the reasons that we chose the river, the Congaree River, on which to build the city was the fact that we had heard about canals being built. We knew about a canal in New York, the Erie Canal that Governor Clinton was working on there. I was one of those who wanted transportation available. And I was one of those who got behind the project to build the Santee Canal. We got professional help, experienced help. We had engineers who came from overseas and to teach us how to operate a canal. While I was still the governor, the Santee Canal was workable, not very much, but workable. It was one of the best things that we had done in South Carolina. I was interested in two other things. One of them was the Order of the Cincinnati. The Order of the Cincinnati honored men, officers, who had fought in the Revolution. They were eligible to join this order. It had secrets within the order, and they honored one another because of their work in the actual, it's what we would call combat veterans. The Order of the Cincinnati, named for a famous Roman statesman who, as the myth told us, while plowing his field, he heard of the war and the need for help, and he left his plow at the end of the road, went to help with the war, and then when the war was over, returned and picked up the plow. Didn't ask for anything in the way of reward. It was his duty to do so. Very admirable. There was opposition to the Order of Cincinnati, however. In the first place, the question came as if indeed the people who could be in the Order of the Cincinnati were those who had been on the battlefield, their sons could take their places upon death of the original. No other person. It was to be sort of a legion of veterans, which in some places makes for a political bloc and an undemocratic society. I didn't much like the Order of the Cincinnati, but my friend, Charles Coachman Pinckney, was in favor of the Order of the Cincinnati, and he had been eventually elected as the national president of the Order of the Cincinnati. One of the people in the Order of Cincinnati, and one who made it acceptable, was George Washington himself. When I heard that George Washington was a member of the Cincinnati, and when I realized that my friend, next door neighbor, was also a leader within the Order of the Cincinnati, I joined. I have been, and I still am, the president of the Order of the Cincinnati of South Carolina. Not of the United States, but of South Carolina. The other thing that I would remember, and I'm trying to write her, I'll let my ink go dry. The other thing has to do with the three major visitors that I enjoyed when I was governor. Three visitors from Europe. One of them was Lafayette, a young fellow who had come from France, having traded his fortune to buy his own ship. And he came with about 9 people to come and help fight for liberty. He happened to land in South Carolina. And so, recognizing him and his purpose, we feted him over and over again with one dance, one recognition, one dinner after the other. It was delightful to have a man like Lafayette on our side. The other man who came, of course, was even greater than Lafayette, and that was George Washington himself. When George Washington made his tour in the South, he came through Charleston, stayed in my house, in my personal house. And I entertained him as a governor might entertain a president, and I did it, I think, well. The third man caused me trouble His name was Edmond Genet. He's a Frenchman. And the French had engaged in a rebellion in France. They didn't like kings in France, but we didn't like kings in England. And that sort of put us in the same boat. What happened to us, as far as France is concerned, is the French sort of exaggerated thing. They chopped off the head of their king and their queen. And the reign of terror came throughout France. Edmond Genet represented the reign of terror, and he came and visited in South Carolina first. He started in South Carolina, made his way north, and traveled through the United States. At first, I was pleased to be his host. I recognized him as one who was fighting against royalty, that he believed in a democratic society. And I sent him on his way to the north, but I still liked him. But in the north, he began to run into trouble. And when the President of the United States, George Washington, announced a proclamation of neutrality between the United States and the neutral in the war in Europe, which meant France, Edmond Genet recruited Americans to join the French army, recruited American ship owners to put their ships at the disposal of the French to help the French fight a naval battle against Great Britain, the Great Naval Battle. He eventually defied the president. He tried to go over the head of the President of the United States in order to get to the American people. Finally, we ordered him out of the country. Persona non grata. As a matter of fact, he pled with us, did we not make him go back to France? Because in France they had changed governments, and he was afraid that once he got back to France, he would be arrested. And who knows, perhaps he would taste the effects of that new weapon they had in France, which they were calling the guillotine. And so we let him live in America under sort of a general honorable estate. He eventually married a daughter of John Jay up there in New York, and John Jay's reputation was enough to save him. You know, I got caught myself with the money problem. I tried to reestablish things, and I had to borrow money all the time, and I couldn't repay. Over and over, I borrowed and couldn't repay. You know, St. Philip's, the church sued me one time. I had not paid my pew tax for 2 years, and the church carried me to court. I admitted that I had paid. They won the verdict, but I didn't have any money to pay them. So they didn't get any money, but they got a verdict. It was embarrassing at the least. There were great numbers of people who had loaned me money, both institutions and individuals. My friend Pierce Butler, another one of those, one who had signed the Constitution, he had lent me £1,000. Really got me out of trouble on one occasion, and I never could repay him. He asked me several times to repay, and I couldn't because I didn't have the money. He finally carried me to court. As a matter of fact, in the last 5 years, as my strength has left me, and my ability to maneuver has left me, and my second wife has died, and my 4 children were all dead before I was. There were bad days for me. And in addition to that, I was in court almost every time for finances, 40 times in the last 5 years. I've lost my house, Northampton that I dearly loved, Kent, to which I had moved a smaller one of my plantations, had to sell it at a low price. As a matter of fact, I had taken up an offer from my grandson, step-grandson. He lived in Charleston, Meeting Street. And that's where I live now. That's where we are now. I'm unable to pay my debts. I'm unable to take care of myself at all. My friends, now, some of them cross the street, so they won't have to speak to me. And occasionally I spend the time, such as the time of greatness that I had with my friend, Francis Marion. Those were the wonderful days. I fear that they'll never come again. And now I've got to finish my letter to Mrs. Marion. Thank you for listening. It seems to be an unwritten law for questions and answers. You don't have any questions? If you have a question that you think I can answer, otherwise, don't. I want to say to you, and I heard my friend, and my special friend of Chris Swagger, tell you that she and I have been on the program every time. But alas, it's time for things to change. And so I have just finished my last program with the Swamp Fox Symposium. And it's sad for me. But, you know, there comes a time when you have to do that. I want to say one thing to the crowd who dares to come out, even when I go overtime. I've been a college professor, for heaven's sake. I don't expect anything else. But I would like for you to know that it is better. Let's see if I can get this right. I wrote it out today. It is better to be a fake somebody than to be a real nobody.